Hi everybody, thanks for joining me here in this video. In this video, we're going to talk about leadership. We're going to go through some of the more traditional theories of leadership, go through some of the contemporary theories, and then close up talking about selecting and identifying leaders. Now, before we can really get into theories about leadership, we need to identify what exactly leadership is. And leadership is the ability to influence a group toward the achievement of a vision or a set of goals. Okay, now as we think about this, I want you to take note that I didn't say that leadership has anything to do with one's position in a company. Okay, and part of that is because not all managers are good leaders. Not everybody who's in a management position actually has the ability to influence other people. Okay. And by that same token, not all leaders come from management positions. Okay. Sometimes we have people who are at line level positions in our organization, ground level positions in our organization, and they emerge as some of our best leaders. Okay. And this non-sanctioned leadership, if you will, it's often more important than some of the more formal forms of influence. And the reason for that is that these non-sanctioned leaders often have the ability to influence employees in ways that other leaders can't. As we go through this lesson, I also want you to be thinking about leaders, to have some leaders in mind as you're going through this lesson. Okay? So I want you to imagine the best leader you've ever known. This could be a boss, it could be a teacher, it could be a coach, it could be anyone in any type of position, but somebody who is the best leader that you've ever known. I want you to think about, why do you think this leader was effective? What made this person an effective leader? Okay. Now, once you've identified this person, you can go ahead and then, as we go through our different theories of leadership here, I want you to think back on the exemplar that you chose, the person who you chose to think about here, and think about what areas of leadership that we discussed today apply to that person. All right. So now that we've got our leaders in mind, we're going to go ahead and start talking about theories of leadership. And we're going to start today with our trait theories of leadership. And these basically focus on the personal qualities and characteristics of our leaders. So these personal qualities and characteristics, they can be related to personality, they can be related to intellectual attributes, they can be related to a variety of different things. But often we take these individual traits and we use them to differentiate leaders from non-leaders. So as we move forward here, we're going to take a look at what some of the relationships between traits and leadership are. One trait that often comes to mind when we think about leaders is the personality trait of extroversion. Okay. Now, extroversion is, if we think about this from kind of a rational sense, it seems to make sense that leaders would be extroverted, right? Because leaders have to interact with a lot of people, they have to give direction. So they really need to be comfortable in these social situations. Okay. And this intuition really helps to explain why we find a relationship between extroversion and leadership emergence, right? Because people who are extroverted, they have this personality trait that we really think leaders need to have. But what's really interesting here is that while extroversion is a pretty good predictor of leadership emergence, it's not actually a great predictor of leadership effectiveness. So the strongest relationship between extroversion and leadership is actually that of extroversion and leadership emergence, not extroversion and leadership effectiveness. As we progress through the big five here, you'll notice that agreeableness and emotional stability are not strongly related to leadership. Okay. Conscientiousness and openness to experience, however, are. Okay, and these two personality traits tend to be related to leadership effectiveness. And this really makes sense if you think about it. Because conscientiousness, this is all about responsibility, right? It's all about being dependable. So if you want somebody who's going to be a good leader, you do want somebody who's going to be responsible and dependable. So it's very intuitive that conscientiousness would be a good predictor of leadership effectiveness. Okay, openness to experience is also related to leadership effectiveness because openness to experience deals with our ability to handle uncertainty. And there is a lot of uncertainty involved when you are leading people. Wrapping up the big five here, good leaders who like being around people are able to assert themselves. Okay, so they've got that character trait of extroversion. Right, they're disciplined and able to keep their commitments, which is related to being conscientious, and they're willing to take risks and handle uncertainty, which speaks back to openness to experience. And if you're familiar with the person in the picture that I have over here on the left, you'll notice that that is Ursula Burns, the former CEO of Xerox. And Ursula Burns is a great example of somebody with high openness to experience. Xerox is a company that we most often think of as being involved in paper products, and the company was struggling when Ursula Burns took over. Okay, but she went in a variety of different directions, sent Xerox down the road of being a more tech oriented company, and really helped to take some risks and change the direction of the company and what she was doing. And she really had to have high openness to experience to be successful in the work that she did at Xerox. And that's a perfect example of how openness to experience is related to being an effective leader. All right, so now that we've talked about the big five, let's talk about the dark triad. All right, and earlier in chapter five, we talked about Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism. And these three traits, known as the dark triad, can lead to leadership emergence. All right, and what's really interesting when we consider the dark triad and leadership effectiveness, however, is that there is a little bit of a space here in the middle where we see that people who are kind of in the mid range on the dark triad traits can actually be more effective leaders. So those who are either very high on dark triad traits or very low on dark triad traits are the least effective leaders, and those who are in the middle are a little more effective. Now, why might those on the outskirts be the least effective? Well, if you think about it, somebody who's high on Mach, okay, they're high on Machiavellianism. They're gonna be very manipulative in things that they do. Somebody who's high on psychopathy, they're not gonna have much regard for others. You know, and these types of traits are gonna inhibit their ability to be effective if they're high on these things because they're gonna have trouble getting the buy-in of their subordinates. All right. However, there is a component where if you're too low on these things, it also makes you less effective because there's a little bit of the dark triad that can help you as a leader. Okay, so sometimes leaders have to make tough decisions where they do need to be able to separate themselves from a situation. And that's where psychopathy can actually help a little bit when we have to separate ourselves from our relationships with other people. Sometimes leaders do need to be able to manipulate a little bit. And that's where being a little in the mid range on Mach can help you out. Okay, you just don't want to be too high or too low on any of these personality traits. Another personality trait that can be related to leadership is emotional intelligence. And as you may remember from chapter 5, emotional intelligence refers to your ability to recognize, understand, and respond to emotions in yourself and others. All right. And one of the core components to emotional intelligence is empathy. All right. And emotional intelligence, as we discussed in chapter 5, can also be kind of related a little bit to self monitoring behavior. All right. And what this all does when you put it together is it allows people to behave in a way that is going to position them to be most effective when dealing with different audiences. All right, so I've actually got pictures of Marvin Ellison up here um, on this slide. Marvin is the CEO of Lowe's, and you see there's two different pictures here. One where he is presenting to probably more like a board of directors, executive type group of people, and another where he's presenting more to employees of a Lowe's store, right? And as you can see, if you look at these two different pictures, you know, he's presenting himself very differently. In one picture, he's dressed in a little more of a professional executive manner. And in the other picture, he's dressed more like what an employee would look like. All right. So he's kind of adjusting his way of presenting based upon who his audience is. And that's a pretty good example of why being high on emotional intelligence would make someone more effective as a leader. As we summarize the relationship between traits and leadership, you know, two key takeaways here are one, that traits can predict leadership. And the second one is that traits do a much better job of predicting the emergence of leaders than they do at distinguishing between effective and ineffective leaders. All right, so I got Steve Jobs over here as a great example of that, right? Because most of the personality traits that we talked about here are things that we tend to envision as being fairly stable over the course of one's life. All right. And while we all look at Steve Jobs when we remember his very successful tenure as CEO of Apple, what many people forget is that that was actually Steve Jobs' second tenure as CEO of Apple. Okay. And he was actually fired after his first turn as CEO. All right. But for the most part, most of Steve Jobs' traits would not have changed between one term as CEO and the other. All right. However, he was a much more effective leader his second time as CEO than he was as he was during his first time as the CEO. Moving on from traits, we're now going to talk about behavioral theories of leadership. And behavioral theories of leadership imply that we can train people to be leaders because they essentially imply that we can train people to engage in successful behaviors. And according to the Ohio State studies, there are two behaviors that accounted for most leadership behavior. Okay. The first one is initiating structure. And this involves things like assigning tasks, clarifying roles, setting standards, and providing deadlines for employees. And the second behavior that they found that was critical in the Ohio State studies was consideration. And this involved building trust, building respect, and caring for people. So, do employees prefer leaders who exercise initiating structure or those who are high on consideration? Well, according to the Globe study, there are actually international differences in terms of these preferences. All right, so depending on what the culture of a nation is like, how people prefer these behaviors changes. Okay, so for example, the Globe studies found that leaders who were high on consideration would succeed best in cultures where people were not used to a leader making decisions alone. Okay, so leaders high in consideration would succeed best in cultures where collaboration was more common than where unilateral decision making was common. So, as we summarize these trait and behavioral theories of leadership, there's a couple important takeaways. Okay, first is that leaders who have traits or display behaviors that are consistent with an area's culture tend to be more effective. Okay, the next piece is that traits and behaviors don't guarantee success because we have to think about context. All right, you may remember earlier in this course we talked about moderating variables or contingency variables, situations where how effective one thing was contingent upon the relationship with something else. Okay, and that's very important to understand as we consider trait and behavioral theory. So over here, I drew a model here that kind of lays this out. So there may be a relationship between a trait, we'll call it trait one, and leadership effectiveness. Okay, but that relationship might also be contingent upon trait two. So there might be another trait that has to be present in order for trait one to be effective. All right, so ultimately what we're getting at here is that the relationships between traits and behavior and leadership effectiveness are very complex, and it's not too often that we can look and see a perfect relationship between one variable here and the other. The next theory we're going to talk about here is the Fiedler contingency model. Okay. And the Fiedler contingency model is a little bit of a complex theory. And I actually have a whole video that's dedicated to it that you can also find on my YouTube channel. But we're going to go over it kind of briefly here and try to get you through the basics. Okay. So the Fiedler contingency model basically says that there's a perfect match, or not a perfect match, maybe an optimal match between a leader's style of interacting with others and the degree to which the situation gives control to the leader. Okay, so what we want to do, according to Fiedler, is we want to make sure that we match the right leadership style with the right situation. Okay, and according to Fiedler, if there is an issue with leadership, we're not going to be able to change that because leadership style is fixed. So what we have to do is we have to adjust the situation. Okay, and in order to identify leadership style, Fiedler used what's called the least preferred coworker questionnaire. All right. And this questionnaire was used to identify if a leader was task-oriented or relationship-oriented. And what Fiedler did was Fiedler asked people to imagine their least preferred coworker, the worst coworker that they've ever worked with, and then asked them to rate this person on a bunch of different traits. Okay. And somebody who had a high score on this questionnaire was viewed to be relationship-oriented, because even though the person they were talking about was their least preferred coworker, they still found some good in this person and were able to evaluate them favorably in some way. Someone who had a low score was considered task oriented because they imagined their least preferred coworker and couldn't actually see much good in this person, so they were considered more task oriented than relationship oriented. Now, Fiedler said there were three important dimensions to the situation. The first is a leader-member relation, so the relationship between leaders and members of the organization. And this one, Fiedler said, was the most important of all the contingency dimensions. The next was the task structure, so how clearly task structures were laid out. And then finally was position power. Position power basically dealt with the decision-making autonomy of the leader. So does the leader have the ability to give you a raise if they want to? Does the leader have the ability to change your working schedule? All right. And while this is an important contingency dimension in Fiedler's model, it also was noted to be the least important of the three. Now, between these three different components to the situation, there are actually 8 different combinations of situations that we can have. And Fiedler had these ranked as favorable all the way to moderate and then ultimately to unfavorable. All right. So basically, how Fiedler ranked these was it started with leader member relations. Okay. Remember, leader member relations was the most important component to the situation. So everything that had good leader member relations is on the more favorable side, and all the situations that had poor leader member relations are on the less favorable side. Okay, so this is broken up pretty simply. All right, then Fiedler looked at task structure. Task structure was the next most important. So basically, if we had good leader member relations and the situation had high task structure, those are the optimal situations. If we have good leader member relations and the situation has low task structure, that's the next most favorable, because remember, leader member relations is most important. Then, if we have poor leader member relations but high task structure, that's the next most favorable. And then, if we have poor leader member relations and low task structure, that is the least favorable. Okay. Then finally, we have position power, and we just alternate down here strong, weak, and so on, all the way down the row. Okay. So basically, we're kind of looking off at pairs. And what you'll see is if we break this down in the middle, we cut this off, we can kind of isolate what our best situations look like. And that's how we get to our most favorable situation, which is good leader member relations, high task structure, and strong position power. All right. Now, what's kind of interesting about this as we look at it is you would think that the most favorable conditions would have the best results for the most components to the condition: leader member relations, task structure, and position power. And for the most part, that's true. Okay, because we have here good, high, strong, that's 3. We have good, high, weak, that's 2. Good, low, strong, that's 2. But then over here we have good, low, weak, and that's 1. And then poor, high, strong is 2. So it's not a perfect linear relationship as we kind of go down the line here. All right. Now, what's important that you remember as you do go down the line is you need to remember that these things are weighted. Okay. And we talked about that earlier. And that's why, because they're weighted, that's why good, low, weak over here is actually a better situation than poor, high, strong. The reason is because leader member relations is more important than task structure or position power or even the combination of them. Okay. Now that we've established how the favorable and unfavorable conditions are identified, let's look at where different types of leaders succeed. So the task-oriented leaders, according to Fiedler, do better in conditions 1, 2, and 3, and condition 8. All right, and the reason is there's two different reasons. Okay, the first reason it goes with condition 8. Condition 8, everything is bad. Leader member relations are bad, task structure is bad, position power is bad. We need a task oriented leader who can get in there and just provide some structure and some guidance so that our people can move forward. Okay. Then, if we look over at the more favorable conditions here, basically what we have in the more favorable conditions here is that things for the most part are pretty good. We don't need a relationship oriented leader who can come in and inspire us and and do all those great things for us. We just need somebody who can help us with the details. Okay, so that's where a task oriented leader is more favorable. Now, over in the middle where things are kind of moderate, what happens is we tend to have a little ambiguity here and there. And that's where somebody who's relationship oriented as a leader can engage with their people and help them through some of that ambiguity. That's why Fiedler said that relationship oriented people are kind of better in this middle space. Okay. Now, the problem that we run into sometimes is, what if we are in, let's just say we're in condition 6 right here, but we have a task oriented leader. How do we resolve this situation and position our leader to perform better? Well, if you think about it, if the task structure is high, we don't want to change that because that's a good thing. Okay. If the position power is weak, we could change that. But if we change that, that's only going to put us over here in this column, which is still an area where a relationship oriented leader is going to be better. So the only thing we can really do here is we need to focus on leader member relations. We need to get our leader member relations to the point that they're good, and that's going to move us over into condition number 2 here. Okay, because then instead of being poor, high, weak, we will be good, high, weak. All right, and that's how we can adjust the situation to make it more favorable to the type leader that we have in position. Now, one last thing that I do want to caution you on here, real quick before we go, is you may have looked at this and said, well, the other thing, if we want to make this more favorable for a task-oriented leader, is we could adjust the task structure and make the task structure low. Well, yeah, I suppose you would do that, and then the situation would be more something where you'd want a task-oriented leader, but we'd actually be making the situation less favorable. Okay, and you never want to make the situation less favorable. You always want to look at how you can make the situation more favorable. So we would not choose to make the task structure um, lower in that case. Now, situational leadership theory basically says that we want to choose what type of leadership style is going to be most appropriate based upon the readiness of our followers. Okay. So in there's a this is a quadrant basically where we look at people's ability to perform work and their willingness to perform work. So over here in the top left quadrant, we have people who are able and willing to perform work. Okay. And to adapt a phrase from the movie Ratatouille, in that situation, anyone can lead. Okay, you could be relationship oriented, you could be task oriented. Doesn't really matter. You're going to be fine if people are able and willing to work. Okay, sometimes though people are willing to work but they're not able to do the work. All right, and in that case, a task orientation can compensate for their lack of ability. All right, because the task orientation can help people understand the job better and help them be prepared to be more successful. All right, sometimes we have people who are able to work but they're unwilling to work. And when that's the case, we really need some support and motivation. That's where a relationship oriented leader might be a little more effective. And in the final quadrant over here on the bottom right, people are unable to work and unwilling to work. Okay. And if that's the case, good luck. Okay. Because truthfully, if people aren't able to work or willing to work, it's going to be very challenging for a relationship oriented leader or a task oriented leader to be successful in that condition. Now, path goal theory, this kind of builds on expectancy theory and basically says there are kind of relationships that we have to look at here. And as we talk about path goal theory, I want you to imagine directive leadership being task oriented leadership and supportive leadership being relationship oriented leadership so that we can kind of tie this back to some of the other theories that we've talked about. All right. And basically what they kind of say here is that task oriented leadership is better, or directive leadership is better when tasks are ambiguous because it can help clarify that. And that relationship oriented leadership can be better when there are structured tasks and there are other components that we need to address. Now, it may look like there's a little bit of a conflict between this and some of the other theories that we did look at earlier, and you might be right if you observe that. Okay, so there's not perfect overlap here, but basically what we're looking at here is that effective leaders help clarify the path to followers to achieve their goals by helping to fill gaps. Okay, so if tasks are ambiguous, somebody who can provide direction is going to be the best leader. But if tasks are structured, somebody who can fill other gaps besides structure is going to be a more preferred leader. Now, one of the challenges that we have with a lot of these more traditional theories of leadership is that they kind of treat leaders as if they exist in a vacuum. Okay, they act like there aren't conditional things that are going to change how somebody leads. They act like leaders treat all of their people the same way, when the reality is that leaders adapt. Okay, and leaders do not behave the same way in every situation, and they don't always treat all people the same way. I'm not arguing that it's right that they don't treat people the same way, but the reality is that they don't always do it. So, as we look at some of the more contemporary theories of leadership, they're going to address some of these points to a certain degree. The first of the contemporary theories that we'll look at is leader member exchange theory. Okay, leader member exchange theory is built off of the idea that within our organizations, we have in groups and we have out groups. Okay, and as people join the organizations, leaders quickly decide that they are either a member of the in group or they are a member of the out group. Okay, and depending on whether they're in group or out group, the leaders treat them differently. So, according to LMX, leaders have much better relationships with those who are in the in group than those who are in the out group. Those who are in the in group are ones that they may privy to information. They may take their consult into decision making. Okay, they treat them a little bit differently than they treat others. Okay, now this stronger relationship that leaders have with those in the in group can lead to more positive outcomes, such as these people can be more helpful, they're trusted, they have higher interactions. Okay, it also can have a little bit of a negative impact on people in the out group, but one of the key things here is that the difference between the in group and the out group cannot be too great. Okay, if how the leader treats people in the in group is too much better than how the leader treats people in the out group, then that's going to have an impact on both groups, because people in the out group will be strongly negatively impacted by that, and it will also impact relationships between the out group and the in group, so that productivity and other workplace related outcomes are not as high for those in the in group. The next type of leadership style that we're going to talk about here is charismatic leadership. Okay, and as we think about the term charismatic or the word charisma, this is something that we think about that has a pretty positive connotation to it. Okay, and charismatic leadership can be very effective. Okay, but what we want to remember is that not all good leaders are charismatic, and not all charismatic leaders are good. Okay, so just because somebody's a charismatic leader, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a good leader. All right. There are four different components to charismatic leadership that we're going to talk about here. And as we talk about these, I'm going to walk you through them using our former president, Donald Trump, as an example here. Now, this is not me advocating for Donald Trump's leadership. This is just me using Donald Trump as an example for the four components of charismatic leadership, because there are some pretty salient examples that we can use with Trump here. All right, so the first component is a vision and an articulation. Okay, so there's an idealized goal that talks about how we're going to be better, right? And Donald Trump kind of articulated his vision through his phrase "Make America Great Again." Okay, and that was kind of his vision that he put out there for his followers. Okay, then there's this component of personal risk. Now, remember, we talked about this earlier in this course. In one of the earlier videos, we talked about how people make their decisions based upon perceptions, not reality. In organizational behavior, people respond based upon their perceptions of a situation, not a reality. So I'm not sure if Donald Trump ever actually took a personal risk as president or as a politician. Okay, but he most certainly created the image that he was taking a risk. Okay, he routinely professed to his followers about the different risks that he was taking, how he was draining the swamp, and how he was bucking the establishment and doing things that were creating a risk. Okay. So whether or not he took a risk is kind of irrelevant. He created the perception that he was taking risk. Okay. Sensitivity to follower needs. Again, I'm not sure if Donald Trump was sensitive to his followers' needs or not. Okay. We'll probably never truly know. But what we do know is that he often spoke about how he cared about his followers' needs. Okay. He often spoke about things like addressing the need for more manufacturing in the United States. He often spoke about things like needing to address infrastructure in the United States. He very much spoke as if he was addressing his followers' needs, thus creating the perception that he was sensitive to them. Okay. And then the fourth is unconventional behavior. And I think we don't have to dive in here too deeply to recognize that Donald Trump often engaged in some unconventional behavior. So we just looked at here are four key characteristics of a charismatic leader through the lens of identifying them through former President Donald Trump. Now, the key thing with charismatic leadership on all the components that we just discussed is that charismatic leaders need to be really passionate about what they're doing. So they have to have strong conviction about their vision. Because if they don't have that passion, it's going to be very challenging for them to get people to passionately support the vision that they have articulated. So are charismatic leaders born or made? Well, some people are born with many of the traits. They naturally kind of have some of the traits that we just talked about with charismatic leadership, that they do these things naturally. But the reality is that charismatic leadership is not very complex. Okay. So people can observe charismatic leaders and start to emulate some of their behaviors. All right. It's also possible that we can intentionally develop some of the characteristics of charismatic leaders. So we can work on speaking in an animated voice. We can work about on making eye contact and having facial expressions that help to generate energy. All right. So there's a lot of things that we can do to develop our ability to behave like charismatic leaders. So we just talked about the question, can you become a charismatic leader? But then maybe an even more important question is, should you become a charismatic leader? Well, charismatic leaders, as we talked about, can be very effective, but they're not necessarily always effective in all situations. They really tend to be most effective when people are under stress or when there's some sort of crisis. And the reason for that really makes sense is that charismatic leaders, they kind of they put out a vision for change, right? And if things are going well, a vision for change isn't nearly as appealing as when things are not going well. So when people are experiencing some type of crisis or stress, they are definitely more open to being influenced by charismatic leaders than when people are satisfied with the status quo. As followers, it's also important that we recognize the potential dark side of charismatic leadership. Okay, there is an association between narcissism and charismatic leadership, so we may want to recognize that people who are charismatic leaders may be a little more focused on themselves than they are on others, and that these leaders don't always act in the best interest of their companies or of other people. So even though sometimes their visions may seem rather appealing, we often need to step back and reflect and take a look at whether or not what a charismatic leader is inspiring us to do is really in the best interest of us or our organizations. So next we're going to take a look at transformational leadership. Okay, and transformational leadership really deals with leaders who can inspire people to do what is best for the organization, whether or not doing what's best for the organization is necessarily in the individual's best interest. Okay, so the person who I have over here in this picture, this is Mike Walsh. He is the former CEO of the New York State Technology Enterprise Corporation. Okay, that is a company that I used to do some on-call consulting for, and when Mike was CEO, I worked directly for him. And I use Mike as an example of a transformational leader all the time because Mike is somebody who is out there interacting with his people and really creates a vision for the company that people can get behind. Okay. And he is great at inspiring people. And the example that I think about is I worked for Mike while I was in my PhD program. In my first year as a PhD student, I had a paper accepted into a conference. So this was kind of a big deal, a milestone for me as a PhD student. and I had to present this paper in New Haven, Connecticut. The night before, I had to present the paper at about 9 o'clock in the morning. The night before the paper had to be presented, Mike had a big event that he was hosting in Saratoga, New York, and he wanted me to be a part of that event. Okay, he felt like that event was very important to the project that I was working on, and thought that I could provide some good value to that. Now, it was absolutely not in my best interest to go to this event in Saratoga because the event was at night. Saratoga's hours from New Haven. It meant I was going to get into New Haven, Connecticut very late that night or possibly very early the next morning, and then have to do my first ever academic presentation on very little sleep. Okay. And the truth of the matter is, though, I had no pressure to do it. Mike would have been okay with me saying that I couldn't do it. But Mike was the kind of person who, when I worked for him, I would run through a brick wall for the guy because he put his employees ahead of himself in many, many cases. He inspired people to do things for the company. And I was excited to be a part of something that was very important for him. So despite the fact that it wasn't necessarily in my best interest to go to Saratoga that night, I absolutely went to Saratoga that night. I also went out for dinner with the entire crew afterwards because I wanted to be a part of what they were doing there. And then I left that and went to my conference probably 9, 10 o'clock at night. I left and started traveling for New Haven. But that's all because Mike is a transformational leader and he inspired me to do things for him and for the company. Now, there are four primary components to transformational leadership that we typically consider. The first one is individualized consideration, giving personal attention to each employee. The second one is intellectual stimulation, which is promoting intelligence, rationality, careful problem solving. Okay. The third one is inspirational motivation. This is communicating our expectations, getting people's efforts focused, and expressing our purpose in simple ways that people can grasp and get behind. All right. And then the final component is individualized influence, which is providing a vision and a sense of mission for people. And this is how we get respect and trust as transformational leaders. Okay. And we often think about transformational leadership within the context of transactional leadership as well. Okay, and with transactional leadership, there are laissez-faire leaders who basically abdicate responsibility. They kind of avoid making decisions and really just tend to be disengaged from their people on the whole. Okay, then we have management by exception. And this can be active or passive, but management by exception focuses on basically addressing deviations from rules and standards. So, in other words, if there's a problem, we address it. If there's no problem, we do not address things. And then the final component to transactional leadership that we tend to look at here is contingent reward leadership. And this is basically kind of an exchange. Okay. So you want to leave early Friday? Sure. Can you have your project done by Thursday afternoon? That would be an example of a transaction that would be based on contingent reward. Now, the full range of leadership model takes those eight components that we just looked at, and it has the two different management by exceptions grouped as one here. You'll notice, but it takes those eight components and it looks at them on a scale here where we rank them from effective to least effective and passive to active. Okay, and it may not be surprise here, but the laissez-faire leadership, that is the most passive and it's considered the least effective. Contingent reward is right in the middle here between active and passive and ineffective and effective. And then the four components of transformational leadership kind of work their way up the scale here until we get to idealized influence, which is considered the most effective and the most active. Okay. One thing that I want to make sure you're clear on as we look at this full range of leadership model is that even though this is laid out as kind of a matrix, so to speak, it's important to recognize that these components here are not mutually exclusive, even though they're presented as such. Okay, so obviously there can be idealized influence and inspirational motivation. These two things can be together. They can also be together with intellectual stimulation. Okay, but it's also, and they can be together as well with individualized consideration. So we'll see all four components of transformational leadership together. But it's also important to recognize that contingent reward leadership can be used effectively with transformational leadership. So you can be a transformational leader, and also reward your people. They're not mutually exclusive. And the way this graph depicts them, though, that may raise questions about that. So I wanted to clarify. Now, transformational leaders tend to build off their own creativity and the creativity of others. They tend to inspire creativity as well. All right, there is definitely a decentralization of responsibility with transformational leaders. And what I mean by that is responsibility for decisions can't all come from a top leader or from the organization, because we can't benefit from our idealized influence here if we're not allowing our people to create some decisions, okay, to take some decisions. All right, there's obviously a propensity to take risks that's involved in transformational leadership. And the reason for this is that we're trusting people to do things. We're trusting people to make decisions. And there's risk associated with trusting people to make decisions. Okay. Compensation, it should be geared towards long-term results when we're engaging in transformational leadership. And the reason is that we're not necessarily trying to inspire people to do the right thing for tomorrow or for 5 minutes from now or for a week from now. We're trying to inspire people to do the right thing in the long term. Okay. And there's got to be agreement amongst top managers about the organization's big picture goals. Because if we're not all working towards the same big picture goals, it's really hard to give our people the autonomy to make the decisions that transformational leadership inspires them to make. And because of some of the things that we just discussed, transformational leadership can be a little more effective in smaller organizations than in larger organizations. Larger organizations tend to have more complexity, more bureaucracy, basically more barriers in place that prevent transformational leaders from being as effective as they can be. All right, now as we look at transformational and transactional leadership, as we summarize here and we kind of compare and contrast them, a few takeaways I want to make sure you walk away with. And the first one is that these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And I know we covered this before, but it does need to be emphasized. Transformational leadership and transactional leadership can overlap, and in truth, they should overlap. A good transformational leadership will have some components of transactional leadership that they engage in. Okay. The second component that I want to make sure we walk away with here is that as we look at the chart that we took a look at before, contingent reward leadership, this is kind of halfway between passive and active leadership. Okay, and that may be accurate, but it's not always halfway between effective and ineffective leadership. Well done contingent reward leadership can be very effective, and it can be as effective as some components of transformational leadership. Okay, but having said that, transformational leadership is more strongly correlated with a variety of workplace outcomes. Okay, so we do draw some stronger relationships between transformational leadership and workplace outcomes than we do between transactional leadership and workplace outcomes. Now, as we think about transformational leadership versus charismatic leadership, okay, the charismatic leader places a little more emphasis on how people communicate. Okay, transformational leadership focuses a little more on the content of the message, but there is a pretty big overlap between the two because they both focus on the leader's ability to inspire followers. Now, before we move forward into identifying leaders, we are going to talk about a few other types of leaders. Okay, the first one is an authentic leader. And authentic leaders, they know who they are, they know what they believe in and value, and they act on those beliefs and values. And they're very genuine in terms of how they act on those beliefs and values. And people can see that they're genuine. The result of seeing that these people are genuine in terms of acting on their beliefs and values is that followers have faith in them. Okay, followers trust them, and followers are willing to build on what they're doing and follow their lead. Now, as we think about ethical leadership, I want you to think about ethical leadership with two key takeaways here. Okay, the first one being that there are not really universal ethics. Okay, there are a variety of different ethical perspectives that we can look at problems through, and two different people who may be ethical in nature, who may care a lot about their values, may look at the same problem through two different ethical lenses and draw two different conclusions. Okay, so just because someone would draw a different conclusion than you does not mean that they're not ethical as a leader. Okay, the second piece is that leaders have to persuade others to act ethically. Okay, that's a key component to ethical leadership. All right, so I'll give you an example. When I was a manager, I believed very much that it was important for us to follow our company's code of ethics. I believe that there were consequences for not following the company's code of ethics, and that basically everything we were doing should be built around our code of ethics, around the law, around doing the right thing, and so on and so forth. And I instilled that value in my people. I made sure that they understood that I was clear on this. I sold them on why I cared about following the code of ethics. And in turn, I persuaded them to behave in a similar manner. Okay. And that's an example of what we mean by ethical leadership. Now, abusive supervision is another type of leadership. This is something that unfortunately I do have some experience being on the receiving end of. Okay. And this refers to people's perception that a supervisor is hostile in their behavior. And this hostility could be verbal, it could be nonverbal, sometimes it can even be physical. Okay. At one point in time, I actually had a stapler thrown at my head in the workplace. All right, while I was working for somebody who was an abusive supervisor. All right, and there are a lot of negative effects that come from abusive supervision. Okay, and it can affect your health. All right, this is something that's very important to understand. And I have pictures of tissues and a scale on here because when I worked for somebody who engaged in abusive supervision, I pretty much had bloody noses on a daily basis working for this person, and the stress caused me to lose an extreme amount of weight. I was down to a very unhealthy weight when I was in this environment just from the stress that I experienced by being exposed to abusive supervision. On the business side, abusive supervision can also impact performance. So I can tell you that when I worked with the supervisor who engaged in abusive supervision, I often found myself making mistakes in front of this person that I never would make when I was not working with this person. But I would get so nervous when I worked with them that I would screw things up that I would never screw up just on my own. And it also can lead to decreases in organizational commitment, job satisfaction, perceived organizational support. Okay, I was very interested in finding another job when I worked for this person. Now this person ended up transferring, and I felt kind of more okay about the situation after that. But I'll tell you, later on in my career, this person and I, we kind of we're getting promoted side by side in our careers. Later on in my career, I was put into another situation where I was going to have to work for this abusive supervisor, and quite candidly, I resigned within a month. Okay, I did not stay and work for this person because I did have a decrease in organizational commitment when I worked for them. And as soon as I was assigned to work for them again, those feelings came back. And I said, I need to get out of this situation and find myself in a more healthy situation for me. Now, servant leadership is a little bit different from some of the things that we've talked about earlier. So, with transformational leadership, we talked about leaders inspiring people to behave in a way that goes above and beyond their own self-interest. Well, servant leadership is kind of the inverse of that. Servant leaders actually behave in ways that go beyond their own self-interest. Okay, and they focus on setting up opportunities for their followers to grow and develop and to do the right things for their followers and to help meet their followers' needs. All right. So, some of the characteristics of servant leaders include listening, empathizing, accepting stewardship, developing people's potential. And there's a great quote here. This time it's attributed to Richard Branson, but there are many other leaders who have had similar quotes attributed to them. And it says here, take care of your employees and they'll take care of your business. It's as simple as that. Healthy, engaged employees are your top competitive advantage. And the idea here that Richard Branson is getting at is we just need to take care of our people. If we behave like servant leaders, our business is going to work out okay because we're going to take care of our people. They're going to take care of everything else. Okay. Now, one of the challenges that servant leaders can have is that sometimes in organizations, people don't always buy into servant leadership. Okay. I had one time in my career where I can remember an HR manager talking to me about being a servant leader, and the HR manager said, "Hey, it's great that you're a servant leader, but you have to make sure that you're working to meet company objectives." And it was an amazing statement to me because I had just increased my revenue in an $18 million business. I just increased my revenue $1 million that year, and increased my profits $400,000, and they're questioning whether or not I'm working to meet company objectives. And my point was, I said, look, I'm just taking care of my people because I know if I take care of my people, they're going to take care of everything else. All right. And that's why being part of why being a servant leader is so important to me. But sometimes it's very difficult to get that buy in from those that you work with or those that you work for. And that was something that became very clear to me in that interaction. A critical component of leadership is trust, and trust is a situation where people are willing to make themselves vulnerable to others. All right, and what that basically means is that someone is willing to take a risk. They're willing to take a risk that if they follow someone else and things don't work out, they are going to expose themselves and have some vulnerability. But if things do work out, they will benefit and experience positive outcomes. Okay, now trust is very important to leadership because leaders are trying to influence others. Okay, so as you're trying to influence other people, you need them to be able to be willing to make themselves vulnerable and follow you. But one of the things with trust is that we have to recognize that when it's broken, it can have a serious negative outcome on not only the leader follower relationship, but also on the overall group's performance. Now, this model here shows us how we build trust and then what the outcomes of trust and leadership are. All right, so over here on the left, we have a leader's trustworthiness. All right, and this all starts with integrity. Okay, so is the leader trustworthy? Is the leader honest? Does the leader display traits that make us believe they're going to be truthful? Okay, next we have benevolence. Okay, and benevolence deals with whether or not the leader has followers' best interests at heart? Is the leader looking out for followers? And then finally, we have the ability of the leader. Okay. A leader can have integrity and look out for our best interests, but if they're just absolutely terrible at their job, we're still not going to trust them. So, does the leader have an ability that makes them worthy of our trust? All right. Then we have our propensity to trust. Okay. And propensity to trust can be influenced by a few things. This refers to how likely an employee is to trust the leader, and this, in part, can be influenced by the personality of the employee. All right. It can also be influenced by the culture of the organization. Okay. What does trust look like within your organization? Time can influence our propensity to trust. If we've been in position for a long time and known the leader for a long time, we may be more likely to trust them than if they're a brand new leader in position. Okay. Now, once we have propensity to trust and the leader is trustworthy, then we can have trust exist within the organization. And when we trust our leaders, when there is true, genuine trust there, we can see more an increase in risk taking. We'll see more information sharing. We'll see greater group effectiveness and more higher levels of productivity. On the previous slide, we talked a little bit about trust propensity, trust and culture, and the role of time in developing trust. But we also need to take a look at whether or not trust can be regained. So once we've established trust and trust has been broken, what happens if if that trust is broken? Okay, can we regain that trust? And the answer is yes, but it's complicated. Okay, it matters a little bit how bad the breach was, how bad the violation was. Okay, leaders who are trying to regain trust also need to acknowledge that they broke trust. Okay, you need to acknowledge, you need to apologize, you need to take steps to regain trust and display trustworthy behavior. Okay, and if these things happen over time, trust can be rebuilt, although it's not guaranteed. In addition to providing guidance and inspiration for followers, leaders often take an active role in mentoring employees or helping them to develop. Okay, and this mentoring role, this can be formal or informal, but really in the mentoring role, what leaders are doing is they're showing employees how the organization truly works. Okay, so they're kind of taking employees under their wing and showing them how to navigate challenges within the organization in ways that training might not necessarily show the employees. Okay. Often we find that informal mentoring relationships tend to be more effective than formal mentoring relationships. And one of the reasons that we think that may be the case is that it's possible that at times we try to put these formal mentoring relationships together, but we don't necessarily plan the mentoring experience the way we need to plan it. Whereas the informal mentoring experience just kind of comes to place in a more natural and holistic way so that it can benefit the employees. Now, from a practical standpoint, we also have to consider how do we select our leaders? Okay, so in identifying our effective leaders, we can use personality tests to identify some leadership traits. But remember, when we looked at personality tests earlier, one of the things that we talked about was that traits were better predictors of leadership emergence than they were of leadership effectiveness. Okay. So, what do we look at then? We need to review specific requirements for a position. And we also need to recognize that general experience may not be as good a predictor of leadership effectiveness as situation specific experience. All right. When I was in industry, I used to hear from people quite often who would say they were happy to hire managers from any industry because they felt like if you knew how to manage people at a hot dog stand, you could manage people in a lumber yard. And if you could manage people in a lumber yard, you could manage people in a factory and so on and so forth. But the reality is, having that situation specific experience that helps you understand the context of leadership is critical to your potential success. Okay. We also need to think about what is our plan? What is our plan for a change in leadership? So we need to always be thinking about succession plans. Okay. What happens if our CEO resigns tomorrow? What happens if we need to get rid of our CEO? Do we have somebody who can fill that void? Okay. And this is critical because if we don't have somebody who's going to fill that void, then when that void occurs, what we're going to end up doing is we're going to end up backfilling that slot with someone who may not be the optimal choice for a leader in that role. So we always need to make sure we do have a plan for that type of change. Finally, once we've selected our leaders, we need to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to provide applicable training for them. Okay. So leaders are some of the most important people in our organizations, and we need to make sure we're providing the training and the resources for them to be successful. All right. And this training is more likely to be successful with high self monitors than it is with low self monitors because high self monitors are going to observe their own behavior and adjust to it based upon the training. All right. In training, we want to make sure that we teach implementation skills so that leaders not only understand the theory behind leadership, but they understand how they can execute different types of leadership. We want to teach trust building, mentoring, and situational analysis. We want to make sure that we engage in behavioral training through modeling exercises that can increase an individual's charismatic leadership qualities. In other words, what we want to do is we want to give people an opportunity to practice what we're teaching them. Okay. We want to review leadership after key organizational events. So we want to not only provide training, but we now want to take and look at how is that training being executed? How is it being utilized in the workplace? And then provide feedback on that. Okay. And we also want to make sure that we train our leaders in transformational leadership skills because these are skills that can be learned and they can be very effective when leaders execute them. All right. So that wraps up our unit on leadership here. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. Thanks for joining me, and we'll talk to you soon.